Great to see everyone here. Hello. Thank you. I am so excited to see everyone here. And thank you for being here today. We know it was a little complex finding this area, so we're going to start, but know there'll be some people streaming in who may be trying to find their way here. Thank you so much for attending what is the 45th Pullias Lecture, an annual event where we bring speakers to represent our higher education community and its commitment to equity. This year's panel addresses a really important topic that I think many of us are thinking about every day, which is the wrong-headed legislative and policy challenges that are emerging in several states that aim to dismantle efforts to advance equity. Yet these moves are a result of the recent progress on racial equity in this country. So even as these challenges emerge, it's important to remember they come on the heels of progress and to remain hopeful. And I think I forgot to say, I'm Adriana Kesar. Sorry. Apologies, just so excited to get started. And I'm the director of the Pullias Center that's hosting this event today. I really want to acknowledge that we lost two of our longtime colleagues in Pullias, Drs. John Slaughter and Tatiana Melguizo. Both of these brilliant equity scholar advocates represented the best of our community. They tirelessly fought for historically marginalized students and aimed to dismantle problematic structures that stood in the way of their success. We'll be having a memorial for Tatiana on April 8th from 11:30 to 1 p.m. here on the campus and available on live stream, just like we're live streaming today's lecture. We've also set up a scholarship in Dr. Melguizo's name for those of you interested in supporting it. And the information is on the postcards on your table for those of you here and on the screen for those of you joining us online. You can support Dr. Slaughter's legacy by sending a donation to the John Brooks Slaughter Center for Engineering Diversity that has been established at USC in his honor. So if you wouldn't mind just please taking a minute with me to honor them in silence. Thank you very much for that. I also want to take time to honor the staff of our center who've been the glue for our community, supporting the students and colleagues that worked with John and Tatiana and who left a significant void to be filled. In addition to supporting our community, the staff, Monica Rad, who's standing in the back, Diane Flores, who you met when you came in, and Cheryl McPhee, all have been instrumental. Thank you. Really, they've been absolutely instrumental in setting up the memorial events and the scholarship and just being general support to our community. I also want to thank Professors Zoe Corwin and Julie Passault for their support of the students and also in helping to set up some of these memorial events that we're holding. And I also want to thank all of the faculty, Adrian Huerta, Joey Kitchen, Steve Desir, Dwana Bradley, Royel Johnson, and our newest member, Ron Hallett, our postdocs and graduate students in our center for their support and kindness and compassion during this really difficult start to the year. Normally, I would highlight all of the tremendous work of the faculty, postdoc, and graduate student colleagues, but there is too much to highlight, and I'm hoping that you're following our newsletter and checking out the website for the Pullias Center. I remain absolutely astonished by their creativity, passion, and impact my colleagues are having on higher education policy and practice. I want to just finish up by introducing our dean, Pedro Noguera, who is moderating today's important panel. Dean Noguera is the Emory Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education. And Dean Noguera's research primarily focuses on equity in K-12 schools and on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. Before joining Rossier, Dean Noguera served as the Distinguished Professor of Education at the University of California, Los Angeles, a tenured professor and holder of endowed chairs at New York University, Harvard University, and the University of California, Berkeley. We feel very, truly fortunate to have him as our dean and the moderator of today's panel. Thank you so much, Pedro.
Good morning, and congratulations on finding this place. Because it wasn't easy, and I was at the Science Center just on Saturday, and I had no idea that this place, I'd always seen this building, but I didn't know what it was. Beautiful building, and we expect others to come, so if there's seats around you, just please let them know, and maybe some of the people in the back could fill in so they could sit in the back, because we know there are others trying to get here. Welcome to the Pullias Lecture. First, let me just say about Dr. Kizar, one of our most distinguished colleagues here at Rossier. Adriana has been a leading scholar in the field of higher education for several years. She recently was awarded the Exemplary Research Award from AERA, the American Educational Research Association. This award is presented to a scholar who demonstrates an unusually high level of accomplishment and whose published research has made outstanding contributions to knowledge and understanding in the field of higher education. We're honored to have you on our faculty, Adriana. For those of you who don't know, the Pullias Center is one of our premier centers here at Rossier and here at USC. It has been in existence for nearly 30 years, and it has been a leading center throughout the nation on studying higher education, and it continues in that legacy. It currently has over $15 million in grants and service agreements, all focused on promoting equity in higher education. Pullias recently established this scholarship, which I hope you will all give generously to in the name of Tatiana Melguizo. We want to continue the work that she'd been doing, particularly focused on community colleges. We feel her loss, but we know that the work she did will continue, both at the center and elsewhere. Finally, the Pullias hosted a webinar promoting Change Leadership Toolkit, which aimed to develop a set of tools and resources to help campus leaders and teams develop strategies and leadership competencies that contribute to implementing, scaling, and sustaining campus systemic change and transformation initiatives. So the work at Pullias is outstanding, and it continues. And we're really happy that they've convened this gathering. So we have a stellar panel. And as you know, DEI is in the news. So much so that even the bridge collapse was blamed on DEI somehow. So to shed light on the truth, to speak to a recent publication about DEI, right, Sean? We have assembled an excellent panel of scholars. So allow me to introduce them, and as I do, if you could take your seats on stage. We have with us Professor Eddie Cole. He is full professor, just promoted at UCLA. In education and history. He is also a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. He's a historian of leadership, race, and social movements through the prism of higher education. His research addresses power and systems of power, education's impact on society and higher education, and organizational change. He uses extensive historical materials to demonstrate the role of higher education in influencing all aspects of American life. He also leverages his research to highlight solutions to the complex and nuanced challenges that have plagued society for generations. Dr. Cole is the author of the multi-award-winning book, The Campus Color Line, College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom. Thank you, Dr. Cole. We're also joined by Professor Liliana Garces. Please join us, Liliana. She is the W.K. Kellogg Professor in Community College Leadership at the University of Texas, Austin. She also holds courtesy appointments at the University of Texas School of Law and the Center for Mexican American Studies. Her scholarship broadly examines how legal and education systems shape educational opportunity and create inequality for historically marginalized student populations. Her interdisciplinary work is grounded in the conceptual understanding that legal and education systems interact dynamically through the actions of organizational actors that initiate lawsuits, influence legal decision-making, and interpret and implement legal rulings within educational context. Drawing from frameworks in socio-legal studies, sociology, education, law, and political science, she employs quantitative, qualitative, and legal research methods to investigate this dynamic. Thank you for joining us, Professor Garces. And finally, we have our own Professor Royel Johnson. He's a tenured professor on our faculty at the Rossier School of Education, with a courtesy appointment at the Dwarak Peck School of Social Work, also on our campus. He is co-chair of the PhD in Education program and the director of the National Assessment of Collegiate Campus Climates at the U.S. Race and Equity Center, which is the nation's leading tool for assessing campus racial climates. He's also co-director of the Research Institute for Scholars of Equity, also known as RISE, based at North Carolina Central University. Dr. Johnson's interdisciplinary research focuses on educational access, racial equity, and student belonging and success, particularly for Black and intersectionally marginalized groups impacted by the criminal punishment, child welfare, and inequitable education systems. He's also the author of the upcoming book, The Big Lie About Race in America's Schools, co-edited with Professor Sean Harper, and due out this September. So, thank you all. I'll have to squeeze through. Thank you for joining us. As I started by saying, DEI is in the news, and we know it has become a subject of great controversy in higher education, particularly in places like Texas. And so I want you to first shed light for the audience on why. What is this about? So we could understand where are these attacks coming from. Seems almost out of the blue. Just help us to understand the political context. And I'll start with Dr. Cole. Or do you want you? It's okay? Okay, we'll start here and just work our way down.
Well, how's my audio? Good? All right. Well, first, good morning. It's good to see everyone, and thanks for having me here. What an honor to be a part of this conversation with these two distinguished colleagues of mine. First, the context. It seems to come out of nowhere, but the historian of higher education in me reminds me that much of this is not new. The attack on American higher education, especially the effort around equity, is arguably as old as American higher education itself. Mm-hmm. So we could go back to 1636, the oldest college existing in the United States, Harvard, and look at its history and work our way to 2024 and see the challenges around who gets into college and who doesn't. What colleges represent for whom and who is excluded. That's built into the fabric of the beginnings of American higher education. So in so many ways, when you think how all of a sudden are, challenges to diversity and equity and inclusion picking up in the news, it's really a matter of this current moment in the challenge against equity, as opposed to just being a new moment in the challenge against equity. Because again, this is woven within the fabric of American higher education, that there are moments for century after century to where we have seen people intentionally excluded from American higher education, specific institutions for people underfunded in American higher education, And so that just sets framing for where we are right now in 2024.
If you don't mind, we'll be on a first name basis, so thank you, Eddie, for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Liliana, you're at the epicenter in some ways in Texas.
Yeah.
Please help us understand the context, particularly there in Texas.
Well, let me just start by thanking you all for the invitation to join. It's really an honor to be here and really meaningful coming back, because I was a student at the law school. I'm not going to say how many decades ago, but really here we're at a time when it's a very well coordinated, very well funded campaign to seed distrust in our education system. And one of the main strategies for doing so is by mischaracterizing educational policies in order to delegitimize them, and then to embed that mischaracterization into our law so that educators are forced to change their practice. So we are right now at a time when we have about, as of last week, I think there were about 80 bills introduced in close to 30 states, maybe more by now. 9 have passed, including in my own state of Texas. And these bills, they date back to September 2020, when former President Trump issued an executive order looking to eliminate diversity training by contractors. And that order was put on hold by a federal court on the grounds that it violated the First Amendment. It was then rescinded by President Biden when he was elected. But in the aftermath, you had coordinated effort to issue model legislation that then began to take hold across states. And the first wave was that wave with anti-CRT legislation in K-12 education. Then the current wave that we're discussing right now, anti-DEI legislation. And it's now gonna be, I think we're gonna start to see a new wave that's even more explicit in infringements on academic freedom. And what this legislation does is it targets initiatives that promote equal opportunity for marginalized communities in higher education. And these are cultural centers, identity-based organizations that help promote a sense of belonging for students of color on campus, equity trainings to help us have more equal hiring practices for faculty. And these are initiatives that ensure fair and equal treatment, but under this legislation, they're characterized as promoting preferential treatment or special treatment or distinctive treatment on the basis of race. And of course, that you can only deem that preferential if you ignore the context of inequity that these policies are trying to promote. And so I think here it's also really important to see the connection to the US Supreme Court's decision on race-conscious admissions and that coordinated strategy to bring the issue back to the Supreme Court at a time that you have a changed composition in the court. And then it ends up invalidating race-conscious admissions based on the reading of the Equal Protection Clause that says by just classifying on the basis of race, you're engaged in racial discrimination, right? That we only address racial discrimination if we just stop classifications on the basis of race, that if we just stop talking about it altogether, we're gonna somehow end racial discrimination. But we know that decades of social science research show that we need to attend to race. We need to speak openly and candidly about it, to use Justice Sonia Sotomayor's words in a prior court ruling, in order to stop race from mattering. And so this idea that these initiatives constitute preferential treatment or that just racial classifications are equated to racial discrimination is in itself an ideology. It's an ideology that's being embedded into law to shape our practice. And it's an ideology that constrains our ability to address the ways that history and historical legacies of racial exclusion have their contemporary manifestations. It's a straitjacket on our practice. And so, we all want race not to matter, but the question is, how do we get there? And we don't get there by preventing us from being free to engage in the policies that help ensure equity.
And just a quick follow-up before I ask Royel. Is there any sign that there's going to be an exodus of faculty from Texas because of these laws? I just keeping in mind also that Texas, not that long ago, passed a law allowing students to be armed on campus as well.
Yeah.
Is that having a chilling effect at all?
I have a lot to say about the chilling effect. I'll reserve that after Royel has an opportunity to comment. But my research team and I have been looking at the impact of this legislation and it at the initial states where we've seen it, and it has certainly led for many a faculty of color to leave. It's led many faculty to even change their practice before the laws are even in effect. This is what we found. And this is a dynamic that my former collaborator, Duana Bradley, a professor here at USC, called repressive legalism. And it's this idea that administrators and faculty are over-interpreting, they're over-correcting. So that's another strategy that's involved here, is to create so much pressure on administrators and on faculty from all the threat of litigation, the Supreme Court decision, the possibility that a bill will be introduced, that they overcorrect in anticipation and give it more meaning than it's really needed.
Well, if you could comment on this, the climate, and how you understand and explain these attacks.
Yeah, so first, good morning. It's good to be in community with you all. Thank you, Adriana, for your leadership of the center, being a steadfast leader, and facilitating this conversation. It's an honor to share this panel with folks who I not only call colleagues, but friends. So thank you for the opportunity to join them. Look, it is open season on DEI, right? And I've been trying to make sense of this moment, and Derek Bell's work, the father of CRT, the progenitor of CRT, offers, I think, some language for conceptualizing what happens. In 1991, he published an article in Howard University Law School Journal titled, "Racism is Here to Stay, Now What?" It's my favorite article. It's perhaps the most transformative article I read as a graduate student. And in it, he talks about what often feels like Herculean milestones, watershed moments as peaks of progress, right? That this pendulum for racial equity often swings forward, and we're able to usher in, for folks who do policy work, these are political windows, policy windows, right? That we're able to usher in unprecedented change. But the pendulum swings back, right? And when it swings back, we're experiencing deep retrenchment. And I think, they alluded to it earlier, that the summer of 2020, when we watched George Floyd, through a state-sanctioned murder, be executed, it galvanized momentum around this country and sort of excitement for taking stock of racist practice. We even evolved in our language. We started using more precise language around anti-racism, anti-blackness, right? September happens, and we get an executive order around divisive concepts. By October, November, December, January, we have white supremacists who storm the Capitol. And under the mantra of taking this country back and making it great again, shortly after, we see a wave of legislation targeted at the K-12 level. CRT, right? The erroneous mislabeling of the 1619 Project, anything related to diversity, equity, inclusion at large being labeled as anti-American and sort of critical race theory. What we're witnessing in higher education is simply an extension of that. It's a white lash. It is the pendulum swinging backwards. But what I fear is that the baseline from which we will start as the pendulum swings back will be, we will have lost too much ground, right? So the very successful politicized campaign that's happening through a playbook of resources and strategies that have rooted itself in the state legislature. They're targeting things that we've worked on for 40, 50 years to make progress on. So I think that is the context, that there is a pendulum. It will swing back, and we will have inertia and opportunity to usher in change again. But the baseline for where we will be starting from, unfortunately, will be different. And that's what I worry about.
Yeah. So Dr. Eddie, I want to get you back. Give us some more historical context, because I think Royel laid out, kind of situate this within just the last few years, but you started by saying, no, we have a history that goes way back.
Yeah.
But this moment is not the same as prior moments, right? This is not the same as the period following end of Reconstruction, for example.
Sure.
What's different about this moment, and how should we understand it in a historic context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do want to talk about some similarities first, but then let me get into the differences. From a similar standpoint, I can't emphasize enough, not just going back to the 1600s or the 1700s or even Reconstruction after the Civil War, but just go back to the 1940s or the 1950s, and you see politicized attacks on American higher education. And so we think about McCarthyism, we think about the very, very strong anti-communist sentiment that any effort toward civil rights, any effort toward equity was characterized as being communist activity. Un-American. That, you could redact the date, and it sounds very much like what we hear today. This push for DEI. How do we make America great again? In the 1940s and 1950s, very much a similarity in the sense of what are these college campuses doing? Are they indoctrinating students? This is not American, what's been taught. So let's control that. So one, again, any effort toward equity, even before we had the language of DEI, any equity effort was characterized as anti-American. And that forced a lot of university leaders back then to challenge those characterizations. Even in California, I like to always remind people that California has won the liberal public relations marketing aspect, but is not necessarily as progressive as the marketing tends to be. And so even the chancellor of UCLA in the 1960s, Franklin Murphy, and the president of the University of California System, Clark Kerr, had to go to Sacramento and speak before the state of California, the state house, the state's Un-American Committee, right, to explain what was considered radical activity and sort of debunk those myths. So I want to give some framing that in similar sense, what we saw then feels a lot like what we're seeing now from elected officials and others. But let me talk about some differences. And my great colleague here, Liliana, just laid out some of these differences about today. I see today as a multi-point, very strategic campaign to work against equity efforts in general. And I really want to emphasize this point in our conversation around academic freedom and tenure. Because in the 1940s and 1950s, there were much stronger systems around faculty coming together to say what can and can't happen from political interference. But if you look back to the last 5, 10, 15 years, as you know very well, when you look at the faculty structure and governance, there have been weakened systems that tended to be able to protect the institution from these kind of political attacks. So now there are fewer, by percentage, there are fewer tenured or tenure-track professors than what used to be. Academic freedom has been under attack. Tenure systems have been weakened. Now take that first point, and then once you have a weakened faculty system, right, then you see the anti-CRT, let's ban what can be taught, right? So now all of a sudden we've weakened faculty protections. Now let's limit what can be taught in the classroom. Now when we move from limiting what can be taught in the classroom, then we fast forward to last summer's Supreme Court decision. Now all of a sudden we see a direct implications for how race is even considered in college admissions. And from there, there was an immediate rebuttal. Well, maybe this means more institutions will find landing places for these talented students, particularly students of color that because of the Supreme Court decision, maybe they won't go to Harvard, maybe they won't go to Chapel Hill, but I heard the HBCU renaissance a lot. But alongside that is decades of underfunding of those institutions by billions of dollars, so they can't accommodate an increase influx in enrollment. And also community colleges have been underfunded for decades. So this multi-point attack, all of a sudden, we're gonna weaken the faculty system, academic freedom, we're gonna limit what can be taught, we're gonna challenge admissions processes. We already weakened the broader American higher education system for access, and now DEI. It's all lumped together. Like, instead of us trying to see these problems as unique and distinctive, they're all interwoven together. And so that's what makes today very different, in the sense that when an elected official used to be able to make an attack on the academy, there were systems in place that buffered the academy a lot from those sort of efforts. And those systems have been weakened so dramatically in the last 10, 15, 20 years that we're in a much different context than we would have seen in the 1940s or 1950s.
Yeah.
Thank you
And
for that. Good.
If I can follow up on that too, is the connection to the challenge with the Supreme Court decision on race-conscious admissions. You know, for decades, you had colleges and universities embrace the rationale of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We had a Supreme Court decision in 1978 with Bakke that really limited what we could do with respect to really addressing and promoting racial equity, and it just gave us this window of diversity, which is it's a tool, but it's not the best tool for addressing racial inequality. But it was a window that I think colleges and universities really embraced for decades, because you also had a robust body of research showing that it helped improve critical thinking skills, it helps dispel racial stereotypes, it helps promote better leadership skills to go on to be in a multiracial democracy.
Right.
But the challenge with the Supreme Court decision, the court didn't go as far as those who were challenging really wanted it to go. It invalidated diversity as a goal for justifying race-conscious admissions, but it also there's some language in the opinion that still allows it for it to be considered. And those that were challenging it wanted it to go as far as just saying any kind of racial classification altogether is prohibited in educational policy. And so these other efforts, the anti-DI legislation, the threats of litigation, the challenges against businesses, other organizations, they're all efforts to expand the reach of the decision beyond what it actually addressed.
Yeah.
Because it still says that diversity can be a laudable goal. It just can't justify race-conscious admissions. It allows for military academies to consider, other institutions to consider it. But with that decision, that moral force that it gave leaders to embrace it as a goal is not as strong anymore. And so I think as a field, we also need to nourish different narratives that are not just about diversity. So while we defend and when we try to defend the goal of diversity, we also need to think about other narratives that are grounded in the freedom that we need as institutions to contribute to a thriving democracy. A freedom that can be grounded in academic freedom and in the principles, and to connect that very closely and intentionally with racial inclusion.
So, Royel, I want to build on that point that Liliana was just making about diversity and democracy.
Sure.
Because some of this seems to be related to the fact that regardless of these attacks, the country is becoming more diverse. And it's not because of immigration. It's largely because of birth rates. The white birth rate is at a negative rate. Asians, Latinos are the fastest growing groups. Country is changing regardless. And so as we try to understand the implications for democracy, how do we situate these attacks on DEI within this change that's occurring?
Yeah, it's hard to work with folks who are not honest brokers, right? The evidence is clear, it's compelling. Folks have done meta-analysis, folks out of UCLA and others, Nita Denson, that the educational benefits of diversity are overwhelming, not just to the individual, but to society as it relates to the preparation of for folks' readiness to engage in a global workforce, right? All of these things are important, and we know that. I just think that, how do we marshal this consistently in the front of folks who dismiss this? I've been thinking a lot about, like, why haven't folks at the state legislature provided evidence about the consequences of DEI, right? That there's speculations, there's hearsay consistently about how harmful DEI is to our country, but I have not seen one reliable study or testimony from folks who can sort of demonstrate that. But what we can demonstrate is that DEI benefits individuals, it benefits society, it benefits our education system.
Yeah. So let me pick up on that theme and go back to you, because I was just at a national DEI meeting of DEI officers in Seattle, and I ran into a UCLA grad who now works at the University of Texas as a DEI officer. And I said, well, what's it like to work there? She said, well, they just told me my office is changed because of something else, but you can still do what you've been doing.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, to what degree is this about a show? That is, that we're gonna pretend, we're gonna engage in this political theater, but we're gonna, because the fact is the country is getting more diverse. We do wanna market to diverse groups of people. If diverse groups of people don't come to our colleges, they'll go out of business. We can't sell products unless we figure out how to do that. Do you think this is a cynical ploy, or is this more sinister than that?
This being the anti-DI legislation?
Yes, because this, as I said, this graduate was saying, she was worried, but I said, are you gonna move? She said, no, they just told me I could keep doing what I'm doing.
Well, we're not able to keep doing what we're doing. And it's what we're learning from the research and kind of understanding how faculty are responding to these threats is we're learning that the messages that the institution is sending are very mixed messages. Mm-hmm. They're almost messages that make you feel like kind of crazy, like a little bit of gaslighting going on, mm-hmm. because everyone's in a really tough spot, right? Like, as administrators, you are feeling the pressure that these proposed bills and enacted bills are creating. They're threatening, like, your funds, right? And so you can very rationally respond in a way that really weighs the risk of, I am not going to engage in a response that's going to be deemed as me trying to get around these laws, right? And so then we end up overcorrecting. Mm-hmm. And the risk that a particular interpretation is going to undermine academic freedom or exacerbate an already negative campus climate for students is not being considered. In that we're at a balance there. I think what we're seeing with administrators is just a lot of silence. Mm-hmm. Or words like, you're going to be able to continue to do what you were doing. But what is the work that we're going to be able to continue to do if we're so restrained? It really is like a straitjacket to be able to implement the policies that we know are going to contribute to a thriving democracy. And faculty, when they're hearing these messages, they're also afraid. So if they're not listening, they're not hearing the message, you are empowered to engage in XYZ because of your rights and responsibilities under academic freedom. When you're not hearing those messages, you self-protect. Mm-hmm. And there's so much questioning going on. There's questioning about, can I put this on my syllabus? Mm-hmm. What if a student then all of a sudden self-appoints as the enforcer of this policy? Mm-hmm. There's so many psychic costs right now for faculty, and it's really suppressing our rights and responsibilities under academic freedom. And we very rationally end up protecting ourselves. In some respects, we've learned, some people are not, faculty are choosing not to disseminate their research findings as broadly as they might otherwise have done because they don't want to be the targets of harassment. And so these are really rational responses, but they are because of the broader environment. And that's what we need to attend to. So when we think about, you mentioned the chilling effect, that when we think of chilling effect, it really limits our perspective to the individual actions, right? Those individual actors are restraining from engaging in a particular right that they have. But what's really, those actions are part of the broader environment. The environment is creating a repressive legalism that educators are under, and we need to address and counter those forces in order to change the action. So, no, I don't think it is this, what was the phrase
So
that you
you don't
used?
think she should feel so safe in
Yeah.
doing her work?
So the Chronicle did a.
Time to leave Texas is yours?
Well, in Florida, there's so many different states that where faculty are really, they're very concerned, and leaders are not engaging in the type of affirmative messages that we need to be hearing, and understandably so, rationally so, because we are not, we've been really addressing this on a state-by-state level. Mm-hmm. And just as of 2 weeks ago, when we had the congressional hearings in DC, and here I want to really laud the efforts that Dr. Sean Harper with the report and the USC Race and Equity Center, published in the aftermath, not just because Eddie and I contributed to the report, but really more because it provided finally, I think, narrative and language that enforces a kind of coalition at the national level to really empower leaders to be able to come back and speak truth to the mischaracterization of these policies that are really being embedded in our laws.
Royel?
So I was just going to mention that, the Chronicle of Higher Education did a survey a couple of weeks back. They surveyed over 120 plus institutions in Texas and Florida who instituted bans. 50 institutions responded. Roughly 24 of them said they made no changes as a result of the legislation. These were primarily community colleges who responded in that way, and we can talk about why that might be the case. Another 10 to 15 institutions say they completely laid off their staff. They tend to be concentrated in Florida, right? Other institutions said they rebranded, right? I want to just acknowledge that the folks who work in DEI positions at large are women of color, are people of color, are LGBT community members, and what this means for them as street level bureaucrats to sort of make sense of this legislative context and ultimately places them in a sort of more precarious kind of position. There have been stories, I think, even in Texas, where folks are going undercover and recording. There was a story, I don't know if it was at UT Austin, but recorded a Black woman who was a program director of a program director goes on record at Houston and says, we just changed the name and we're still carrying out our services in support of students, and she's now suspended, while they investigated. So there is a witch hunt happening too. I think it depends on the visibility of the institution, right? State flagship universities like UT Austin are going to be more susceptible to scrutiny and questions about whether or not the law is being enacted, while some other institutions who are never on the radar can in fact probably carry out their work in ways because they aren't being scrutinized. But to Liliana's point, it is a very serious context, especially depending on the location that you're sort of situated in and your identities as a person who is occupying this position.
So I want to. This is getting a little depressing. So I want to. I want to get some sense of possibilities, right, for where resistance occurs. And Eddie, you made a connection to the House on Un-American Activities and the attacks on academic freedom that occurred around the country, but especially in California. We still have a loyalty oath in California on the books that you must sign to work here in the public sector. And if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, they went after the father of the atomic bomb over this. But we also know that there was resistance. And even with the loyalty oath on the books, there were, the 60s happened, there was big resistance, not just here in California, but throughout the country. So where do you see resistance is possible despite these severe restrictions we're seeing?
Well, one, I always lean toward the past as providing an insight for the present. And so in a lot of ways, I was just talking about this last night, but in a lot of ways, understanding the truth, right, to the report from the USC Race and Equity Center, understanding the truth is actually really helpful because you can get distracted really easy today. by so much of the noise happening around what DEI is, what it isn't, what equity is, all these things, right? But in a lot of ways, if you step back and know that history and can even look at the broader context, it actually is good framing for you to make sense of how to navigate this current context. An example of this, I tend to, speaking of leaders in silence, when I'm in more intimate conversations with academic leaders, I tend to ask them, how often do you have a reoccurring meeting with, say, your vice president of finance, right? Or your director of human resources, and all the hands in the room go up. These are chancellors, right? Of course, right? This is a reoccurring thing. This sort of standard practice for leading a university. But then I often ask, how often do you meet with, say, the campus archivist, the university librarian? No hands go up, right? And that is a perfect example of leadership right now operating within the present without constant conversation about the past. How can you lead an institution if you don't even know the history of that campus? And I'm not talking about institutional history, like when was it founded, when did it go from college to university. I'm not talking about high-level institutional history, but what I'm really talking about is understanding the social history. Because when you understand the social history, you understand the people's history of your campus. Because different groups have their own histories of your campus community. The relationship between USC and across the street is important. Do you understand that history? And when you have this broader understanding of people, you start to put people first in your decision making. That's where I find hope. If we can just change the way that we think about our campuses, the people, start putting the people first and understanding social history first in our decision making instead of putting the institution and institution history first, that gives us a wonderful opportunity to better understand the challenges that have come before us and how our predecessors have navigated those challenges, and also how our predecessors have messed up and perpetuated issues that have landed now with us today, decisions made decades ago. But you can't address a lot of these issues if you don't even have the context and understanding of where they've come from. The archives are right there. I probably spent more time in the USC archives here on this campus than a lot of people. But that gives me better understanding of this university and many universities across the United States. And that's what I think is tasked before all of us. How do we start to rethink institutions, the history, how history has shaped the present, and what that means for us as we think about a future?
And either of you, Liliana or Royel, as you think about possibilities for resistance, for subversion, even in this climate, what comes to mind?
Well, in one of the first empirical studies of how faculty are responding to anti-DEI legislation that was done by one of my very talented graduate students, Jackie Pedro, in a report published by the UC Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, what she learned was that faculty of color, who are the ones that are most impacted outside of DEI administrators by these policies, were able to leverage the rights and responsibilities under academic freedom when they were working in collaboration and coalition with external organizations like AAUP or PEN America or other organizations that were able to empower them in understanding what their rights and responsibilities were under academic freedom. And so we need a lot more of these coalitions. We need to address the current context as a system that is getting a lot of pressure from the legal side via the legislature, via the courts. And we have a lot of other organizations that can create counter pressures so that the actors within the institutions of higher education can feel empowered to respond. So we need more reports like the one that Dr. Harper recently published to empower actors within, leaders, administrators with a narrative that is grounded in the freedom that we need as institutions of higher education to engage in the policies that are going to serve the interests of individuals and society. We all gain from these policies. So we need to really counter this framing of scarcity, that when you lose, or when you gain, I lose. We all lose when we lose DEI policies.
Right.
And these are intentional mischaracterizations that, at least as an initial step, we need to identify that these are laws that are trying to entrench the very misguided, profoundly misguided characterizations of educational policy, and that they're based on an ideology that is really going to suppress our ability to be free to engage in the policies that we know are in the best interest of all our students.
Yeah, Royel?
So boards of trustees have been interestingly silent in a lot of these conversations. We've seen them be incredibly problematic with the, Nicole Hannah-Jones, right, and the 1619 Project. But I think that's a lever that we haven't used as much, right? Board members have a fiduciary responsibility for the institution. Some of that is around the financial well-being, but it's also around like the reputation of the institution. There are a couple of points that intersect, one of which is around accreditation. 5 of the major 6 accrediting bodies in this country have principles around DEI. They're not hard standards, but there are expectations that institutions ought to be meeting as it relates to accreditation. We need to start shaping the narrative of how not, supporting DEI initiatives on our campus place us at risk of accreditation, inspections and inquiries. The other one is around dollars. That is a language that board members sort of respond to, right? The finances. NIH, NSF, other major funders in this country that major research universities rely on consistently for their institution have expectations around DEI. Even NIH has expectations around the composition of the team, right? We need to be marshaling these arguments to state sort of board members of institutions who oftentimes are appointed by governors, through a public institution, who have political ties, who are situated within the social political context of the state that can move the needle. I think interest convergence is one sort of strategy that CRT consistently sort of offers us to speak a language that they might be receptive to.
Let me elevate that point about accreditation. Because I think that is a powerful tool, if you will, that has not been at the center of contemporary dialogue in the way that it used to be historically. I can go example after example of from Georgia to Alabama and Mississippi in the 1950s and 1960s, where there were limits around who could come speak on certain campuses in the South. If you were in favor of ending segregation, the University of Alabama or the University of Mississippi would clearly limit your ability to come speak on that campus. And the same thing around the legal argument of desegregation, right? Could students who weren't whites finally enroll at these segregated universities? And what's consistent in the archive are, telegrams and letters from the regional accreditation agency saying, if you don't desegregate, all public institutions in your state will lose accreditation. The University of Mississippi eventually integrates, if you will, by definition, right? Alabama, the same. This is a very real threat because losing accreditation is linked to the dollars, the federal dollars, financial aid, et cetera. And I've been really struck by how we haven't seen major headlines of, Florida, the University of Florida, or UT Austin or something. It's really interesting point that I think boards and academic leaders, presidents, chancellors, and all of us really should think about the role of these sort of external bodies in shaping, protecting institutions from political interference. And that's really what it comes down to. That is a requirement for an institution to remain accredited, that it remains not influenced and under the direct influence of elected officials, because universities, although even in public ones, universities are in this unique space in American society where they should be able to function independently, not at the mercy of who's in office at this moment. And accreditation agencies back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were a huge role in making sure that didn't go too far.
That's interesting. So let me bring up, it's not a hypothetical, this is a real situation. We have, I'm not gonna name the individual, but a well-known race scholar who's written about critical race theory, president of a major public university in the South.
Oh, yeah. That narrows it.
Who took the lead in eliminating DEI. Probably at the behest of the governor.
Sure.
Now, my hunch is that his views about race didn't disappear.
Right.
But he has a different strategy at work here that he's trying to pull off and still survive in the role. Is this a fool's errand, or is this, you think that he might be onto something? And as you think about that, I'm reminded of the fact that USC, during World War II, expelled Japanese American students.
Yes.
And didn't allow them back. But today, the president who carried that out, his name was removed from the building on campus, has now been replaced by the first Native American graduate. So, I'm trying to get some possibilities for action, even in this very repressive climate.
So I was just talking to Liliana about this. One, you know, that president, and I'd imagine that the work to support students with minoritized identities is still happening in ways that are important and transformative, I would hope. You know, I've been really reading about targeted universalism as a potential framework for how folks sort of respond to political gridlock. And, you know, I do lots of talks every year around belonging. And it's increased over the last year because folks find belonging as a topic more palatable.
Better than inclusion?
Well, you know, but rather than, you know, racial equity, anything around race, right? But if you ask me to come into a belonging talk, it's race, it's equity-minded, it's anti-racist, and so forth. But if we can think about, like, you know, the idea of targeted universalism is that oftentimes in universal approaches, we miss the nuance that's needed that recognizes the individual positioning of people within systems and structures, right? But in targeted approaches, we have stigma that is associated with it's the handout. SNAP benefits, right, are an example of a targeted. But what happens when we merge these two as a political framework, that we think about what are the broader policy goals that we can get one on board, like belonging. Everyone wants to belong. It's a basic human need, right? That's a universal goal that people can get on board to. But what are the targeted levers and mechanisms that I create within that structure to facilitate one's movement towards that goal in progress, right? So I'd imagine that some organizations are thinking about renaming things in ways that are a bit more palatable for folks in contexts where, you know, it's prone and subject to more scrutiny, but are creating the pathways and structures to target the individual sort of positioning of students and recognition of that structures are at play that position one differently within it. I think that is a possible political frame for these contexts where it truly is a gridlock and there is some give and take that's necessary for advancing agenda.
What do you think about that, Liliana? Does that seem viable?
Well, I'm
Down in
all
Texas.
about being strategic
It's the pragmatist in me.
for narratives, and I think that's what very much what this moment really calls for is for us to be strategic in that. And I know there's a lot of research right now going on with like what is going to appeal to our country right now when we're at a time that we're just so divided. We're so divided, and our ability to be free, so like the freedom to, I think is one that I recently, I understand like some research has shown, you know, it resonates. And that that to me is also really foundational, and it speaks to what these policies are doing. They are constraining us. They're forcing us. They're keeping us from being free to engage in the policies that research shows is to the benefit of all, for all our students. So saying all our students, it goes into that strategic universalist language. But I think the really, we need to name the ideology that is being imposed on educational practice. An ideology that is contrary to what we know empirical research shows for how we address racial discrimination, how we can bridge the divides that we're in as a country. We don't bridge divides by ignoring the ways in which race shapes educational opportunity or the way that you and I can engage with one another, what I need to do in the classroom to help promote cross-racial understanding. Those efforts to constrain those actions are, I think, maybe we address it with a framing of we need to be free from the interference and to engage in educational practice. One possible approach.
Yeah.
So we're running out of time, but I want to bring up one more topic. We're in the middle of the March Madness, and as a basketball fan, one of the things that always strikes me is how many of the teams fielded out there are almost all black, right? Even on campuses that have very, very few black students. Professor Harper, who's been mentioned a few times, recently said, what would happen if these students use their leverage, not just to get commercials or more revenue for themselves, which I'm not against, but to insist that these DEI efforts be protected. Do you think there's a leverage there that we're not considering? What about you, Eddie? What do you think about that?
That's an Eddie question.
I was going to say the same.
Well, first of all, yeah, I'm following March Madness like usual, basketball fans. And that could be an approach, yes. But that feels like that could be an approach for the broader campus. You know, basketball, think about a basketball team. Scholarship athletes, maybe that's 15 players, and maybe, whatever the percentage. I think that's admirable if a team were to say, we're going to protest, our state did this, X, Y, Z. But when you think about the long history of Black student activism, it was the overall collaborative nature, the coalition building that really created change. So when the basketball team and this student group and that student group, et cetera, came together, those are powerful moments. I think about the Black student movement at the University of Michigan, late 60s, early 70s, and they made demands to campus. And within their 9 or 10 point list of demands, one of the Black student requests was that they demanded the university hire a Chicano studies professor. The Black students made that demand. Because in the coalition building, that approach, getting the basketball team and the Black Student Union and the Asian American Student Association, right, to come together and work, I think that is powerful. So yes, March Madness could be the focal point, but if I were to see some basketball players take a protest, I will hope there will be dozens of their peers next to them also, and possibly a few faculty and administrators as well. So not to put it all on those 10 basketball players, right? Yeah. But to think about how we all could use that moment to make a broader point about DEI on campus That's the power of student organizing, student activism. The blueprint from the history is right there in front of us and is ripe to be used today.
Liliana and Royel, final thoughts on this?
I mean, I think we also need professional associations, right? We see the attack now happening at medical schools. So where is the American Medical Association saying that diversity is so important for what we do and part of our mission? Many of these organizations at the height of 2020 were making amends and recognizing medical, malpractice and, racism and so forth. The American Law Association, ABA, Bar Association, Dental Association, Optometry. Where are the associations who are uniformed in saying that DEI is crucial to the work that we do? I think that's another lever that folks are targeting these professional fields because it will generate the attention from the public and interest in it. So I think that's another lever.
Yeah.
Liliana?
Are these our final words?
Pretty much. for now.
Until
Okay,
next
for now.
time.
So it was last couple of weeks, I was listening to a webinar where Dr. Ruth Simmons, former president of my other alma mater, I was there after, but anyways. She was speaking about her recent book, Up Home, One Girl's Journey. And she said these words. She said, "The truth lives longer than anything you put in its way." And they just really stuck with me. And the truth lives longer than anything you put in its way. And that's where we are right now. We need to come together in coalition in defense of our ability to teach the truth, in defense of our students' ability to learn about the truth, and in defense of our institutions' ability to continue to have the autonomy to engage in the educational practices that contribute to our thriving democracy. And so that stuck with me, and I hope it sticks with all of you as well, because the truth lives longer than anything you put in its way.
Right on.
Yes. So as you were saying that about the truth, it made me think of Galileo, who had to recant, lest be murdered. And then in his last words, he said, "No, it's still there." And so maybe that is a good point to leave on, that yes, this is a moment of attack, but it's a moment. And as we look through history, we've seen other moments like these. I was in South Carolina this February and, went to Mother Emanuel Church where 9 Black worshipers were murdered by a racist. But what struck me about the visit was learning about the history of slave revolts that started in 1536 and went all the way through, and knowing that so much of the resistance came out of South Carolina. So I think your point about the truth enduring is an important one for us to take. So let's thank our panelists. Thank you, Pullias Center, for bringing us together. And Adriana, you get the last words?
Well, we've got about 10 minutes for questions
Oh,
if the
perfect.
panelists
Even better.
are open to that. So I think there might be a microphone. This one is on. Okay, we'll bring this microphone around. So please raise your hands, and we'll have we'll probably do 3 or 4 questions.
I'll try to be succinct.
Thank you so much. So I champion your future higher ed students, Girl Scouts in TK through 12th grade. And the girls that I work with are keenly focused on DEI. So my question to you, they're your future students and they are already leading, but how do we give them hope and then ways to make a difference so that they see the institutions as places where they will belong?
Hope.
I can chime in. It's interesting. I just finished a book and submitted it the other day, and one of the chapters focuses on hope. And I was sort of fascinated the theoretical foundation of hope theory beyond just sort of being these orientation towards optimism, positive outlook. But goal, part of being hopeful is having goal-directed thoughts, right? So how do we support you in your aspirations and connecting those to very tangible, specific things, right? That's part of the psychology. The second part of hope theory says that folks have to be able to identify viable pathways towards achieving a particular outcome. So beyond, saying that I want to do this, how do we have candid conversations with young people about that if this route doesn't work, there's a plan B, if plan B doesn't work, there's a plan C. And then the third part of hope is that folks are motivated to behave and move in ways towards that goal, right? So I think part of supporting young people is exposure and having candid conversations, being able to connect the abstract to the tangible. But the second part is being able to allow them, nurture the imagination of possibility, that when I'm confronted with a challenge and a barrier, that there's another pathway. I think that is the foundation of hope theory, and I hope that's useful for how you think about supporting young people.
I see one back there, way back. Oh, sorry, you have them.
I'm just checking. Good afternoon. Thank you for your enlightening statements. In terms of talking about the pendulum, and recalling my undergraduate years when the UC system abolished affirmative action from its admissions back in the summer of 1995, based on your positionality, what are some of the things that you see in the works of that pendulum moving back? Things that are in the efforts to make sure that this long pendulum of eliminating affirmative action, combating DEI, and marginalizing CRT, what are things that are in place that you see that are helping this pendulum move forward in different directions positively?
Well, I'll just say, just the work of that faculty do to illuminate the ways that, is it on? Okay. That race and racism operate in our society. The ability to shed light on that, to generate the knowledge that we need, that to me is the hope. That's what it's like. It's my duty to engage in that work and to defend that, which is what's being challenged right now. Because it's about the generation of knowledge and how students are going to be trained to be able to go on and engage in their future career. And so I'll just speak from the place that higher education as institutions are the place where so much of that work will come to help generate the ongoing pendulum. But we need the help in the coalition of all the other actors that are needed to empower us to do that work.
Thank you. First off, I want to say thank you all for your time. It's greatly appreciated. The question that I had was, you all talked about the notion of freedom, hope, and connecting the abstract to the tangible. What are your thoughts when you factor in things such as class and the generational gap that exists?
The gaps. Can you say that the last part of your question again? Because that we were asking.
Boomers, Gen Z, and these folks, and there's a generational gap that exists where the knowledge isn't being passed down, or the lack of how to connect with the generations. Because we're all here in this forum, right? But I don't see no young person here in this forum. I don't see other things. And so what are your thoughts when you factor that in? And then also when you factor in
They're watching the live stream.
The class piece.
He said, I don't see young people here.
Young folks up here are saying, what about this?
And I mean that respectfully.
Let me quickly weigh in on that across the generations, because that's a great question, because in one aspect, I've been thinking a lot about even the idea of DEI as a term. And as someone who studies history, I think so much about the work of like the Fannie Jackson Coppins, the Du Bois, the Carter G. Woodsons, et cetera, who were ultimately doing this type of work before we even thought about calling it diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so the tradition of what people are trying to do is there. And it's important to teach the younger people, not the young, teach the younger people that their problems that they see now aren't new. And I don't want people to get overwhelmed by facing these problems that they feel have come out of nowhere for them. There are elements of this that have been around for a long time. And the pendulum, as we see, swings. And so this fight is ongoing. I talk about the long game all the time. The fight against DEI, they very much understand the long game. The challenges to equity has been an ongoing fight, a legal struggle, right? You mentioned Baki. This is a multi-decade, multi-generational effort against equity, and there has to be just as much of a commitment to the long-term effort for equity. As we've seen people do for generations before we were calling it this, and long after we stopped calling it this, the work continues. And so that, I think, is so important for when we have conversations across generations to help people understand the essence and length of these problems, but how they're also part of carrying on a tradition and taking it from one generation to the next. It's not all on them. People have been carrying this before them, and they have to make sure they lay it out to where people who come after them can continue to move forward as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is this still on? Yeah. So I want to, again, as Pedro did, thank our panelists for this wonderful talk. We now have an amazing lunch set up for you all to go to, and you gave us so much food for thought. And hopefully we're all thinking about, I'm leaving thinking about that narrative that we need to be creating jointly that is going to help frame this next era in support of diversity, equity, inclusion, of all these potential players, whether it was boards, accreditation, students of this generation that can coalesce. There's all sorts of potential and strategic alignment that can be had. So I think, as Liliana kept bringing up, we just need to see more alignment of the kind of disparate players. And so I think bringing back to Royel's hope, I do think there is a lot of hope if we all just see our agency in this moment. So thank you also, Pedro, for moderating this panel and bringing some very provocative questions. And it was a great day. Thank you very much.